Greg Geronemus, welcome to Acquiring Minds.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me, Will.
Greg, today you are a traditional search investor via your firm Footbridge Partners, but your journey into ETA began with your own search, a very successful one. And today we're going to hear that story. Let's start off with some background on you, Greg, going back before your search and how your path led you to buying a business.
Sure. So I guess it starts way back growing up in New York City. I was lucky enough to be a fly on the wall in my dad's cosmetic dermatology practice, where he was quite entrepreneurial. And I got to see him up close and help where I could. In some cases, just as a filer, in some cases, helping with insurance claims for some of the work that he did that was non-cosmetic, but just generally being a sounding board and getting to observe him, which was very meaningful. I was also lucky enough to meet my wife in high school. So that
high school sweetheart. Look at
high school sweethearts. I went to Harvard undergrad, wonderful experience, and I admittedly followed the herd to Goldman Sachs and worked in one of their private equity arms. Wonderful experience in many respects, learned a tremendous amount, but I also had this sense that, even at the age of 23, 24, that I wanted to do something entrepreneurial. And I thought that business school would be a good time to figure out the next great startup idea. Fortunate enough to go to HBS, back to Boston, and I had planned to use that time to come up with a great idea, played around with a few concepts unsuccessfully, and then for me, magically learned of this search concept. It wasn't a given even back in 2011, 2012 that on HBS's campus, you would learn even what a search fund was. I felt lucky to hear a little bit about it. Started exploring the concept with a good friend of mine, David Rosner, who became my business partner, is still my business partner. And it was, for both of us, it was really love at first sight for the search fund path. It was in many ways a more attractive risk reward for us than a pure startup idea. And it drew upon both of our experience in private equity before business school, and we decided to chart that course as traditional searchers looking for a business to buy.
Two follow-ups to that, Greg. The first, so 2011, 2012, had Rick and Royce started their class yet, and did you take it?
Good question. They had not started their entrepreneurship through acquisition course. They had their financial management of small firms class in the first semester of second year. And I actually didn't take that class because I wasn't aware of it yet. My business partner, David, did. In the fall of our second year, we started talking much more seriously about raising a search. And we approached Rick and Royce about doing an independent project second semester on the entire search fund ecosystem and helping us chart our course. It turns out that what started as an idea for an independent project actually blossomed into a class that came together very quickly with, I think, 35 or 40 students in our second year of business school, in the second semester of second year, I should say. And that was the first go around of their now very well known and successful entrepreneurship through acquisition course.
Wait a second, Greg. Maybe I misunderstood. So you have the idea for an independent project, go to Rick and Royce, and then that catalyzes a course. Basically,
a few other people started. They got wind of it, and then word spread, and then a course came to be that pretty much on the fly, and they did a great job at putting it together, sort of building the plane as they were flying it, and it was best course I took at HBS for sure.
Wow, Greg. Well, that makes me feel like you're part of ETA history. That you were kind of behind the scenes and influence on that first course, because obviously that course has been very, and then the book that came from it has been very, very influential to a lot of people.
Well, Rick and Royce deserve all the credit. They've He's done a great job
Yeah.
for over a decade now.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to be clear, what you were saying about your upbringing. So fair to say that it was kind of a small business family, yours?
It's a medical family that became a small business family. So it started just as my dad as the sole physician practicing on his own, and it turned into a 15 physician practice at its peak, and he eventually did sell to private equity, and I was able to help him with that. That was much more recently, but yeah,
wow.
certainly a medical family turned small business family.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Greg. Okay, so take us into the search itself. What do you remember from it? What can we learn from the search process that you and David embarked upon?
So there were a couple key tenets of our search. We did raise traditional search capital, but it was before the time where there were a lot of traditional search investors. So it was really search capital cobbled together from old bosses, mentors, people hanging around the HBS campus, and so it wasn't nearly as formal and institutionalized as it is today. We did a geographically focused search, so we were based in New York, and we were only looking at businesses in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, and parts of Pennsylvania. And that was largely driven by our both of our significant others. Dave's wife, Lindsay, who had a job that she absolutely adored on Wall Street, and my wife, who had just signed on to do a 4-year psychiatry residency at Mount Sinai Hospital. So we were geographically bound. I'd say as a result of that, fairly industry agnostic, and very much high volume by design. So we were not picking and choosing who we reached out to. We were pumping as much as we possibly could into the top of the funnel. So much so that I unknowingly emailed my cousin I think on 3 occasions about buying his business that was based in Queens. And I think the first 2 times it was funny, and the third time he was actually kind of annoyed. So
it's like, dude, you realize you're spamming us all.
Yeah, exactly. But in addition to high volume email, which I just alluded to, we also did quite a bit outside of our office, away from our computer. We really leaned into local networking. I remember attending event after event hosted by accountants, lawyers, lower middle market banks. And it turns out that the event that or the tactic that led to our finding the business that we ultimately acquired and operated and sold, a company called smarTours, was through a networking event, a happy hour in Midtown Manhattan, hosted by BDO. And
if you know, you know.
Exactly.
That's their tagline, right?
Exactly. I didn't know, but
I
shortly
still don't.
thereafter, yeah, exactly.
So this is one of those stories which is such a pattern where you do all of this mass outreach. You go through the motions of just casting the net far and wide, and then it's a single kind of conversation, in-person conversation by chance that leads to the deal. Not to say that there's anything flawed about doing the casting the net thing, but it does seem like people. I've had so many guests who kind of smirk at the irony of doing so much work in their search, and yet the business was around the corner, a friend of a friend, sort of thing. Sounds like the case here as well.
Absolutely, and I preach that to searchers that we work with to this day, that there's a certain sense of productivity from being at your desk making calls or sending emails. You can add to the tally of what you're putting into the top of the funnel, and I'm still to this day a big believer in high volume, and we've seen that work extremely well. High volume email, cold calling, etc. But you're doing yourself a significant disservice from just sticking behind your computer screen, and it's really valuable to get out there and meet people. And in our case, I had a really wonderful conversation with a commercial banker. He was with Capital One at the time, and he said, "You've got to meet my high school buddy." I think it was his high school buddy from 50 years prior, but a high school buddy nonetheless. And I had the opportunity to meet his high school buddy, this relatively sort of small, ran a small accounting shop, and he explained to me that one of his clients, who runs a company called smarTours, had told him that he was interested in selling, and we had a nice chat. And then before I could even really, research the company or do any real diligence, he took out a piece of paper and he started sketching out what he thought would be an attractive deal structure between us and his client. And that deal structure actually formed the basis of the transaction that we ultimately closed.
Wait, he's doing a napkin deal structure at this. Sorry, what was the event? At the BDO? At the BDO event? No, later.
No. So met the commercial banker from Capital One at the BDO event. He said, "You've got to be my buddy, my high school buddy, the accountant." So a few days later, I had coffee with this accountant, and the accountant, it wasn't quite a napkin, it was a piece of paper, which he had in his briefcase, because he was still a briefcase guy. And he starts sketching out, around 5 times EBITDA with a 60% seller note and priced at 4% interest. And I had to restrain myself. I not let on that I found that to be quite attractive. And
let me pause you on that, Greg, because we want to spend some time on that point of the story. But just before we do, the size of business that you were targeting was similar to what a traditional searcher would target today. What size of EBITDA were you and Dave looking for?
Yeah, we were looking for businesses in the 2 to 5 million of EBITDA range. So fairly similar to what a partner traditional search would be looking for today. We certainly had a bias towards the upper end of that range. And so not too different from what you see today.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then I have just noticed how few New York-based searchers I've had on. I can only think of one. I'm probably two. But I'm probably forgetting somebody. But given the population of the area, you certainly don't hear about stories of people buying businesses in New York City proper, any of the boroughs. I haven't. But even in the tri-state area, you don't see much. I don't know why that is. Maybe everything's overpriced there, but you'd still think that given the population density and the quantity of businesses there and the people coming out of finance wanting to buy their own business, you just see a lot more businesses coming, a lot more search stories coming out of the tri-state area. Is that also been your experience, your observation, or no?
We've seen a number. It's certainly not as many as you would think based on the fact pattern that you laid out. I can think of a few other search businesses that were Manhattan based in particular, or certainly tri-state area based. There are a couple factors at play. One, it's not the easiest state in which to, or New York at least is not the easiest state to run a business in. It's also, many search businesses are services businesses, very people intensive, and the wage requirements and expectations are quite high. And there's a general sophistication, I think, of the business owners and sellers, and they're more inclined on the margin to hire an advisor or push for top dollar.
Maybe before we hear about this proposed deal structure, and not only the structure itself, but the kind of interesting psychology of that and what has led you to kind of how you coach searchers. Tell us the bullet points of the business in question, smarTours.
So it was not a business, not an industry that we were particularly interested in. It's a classic sort of old school tour operator. And by that, I mean a company that sends travelers from the United States, in their case, to mostly exotic destinations around the world on old-fashioned group trips. So if you've ever been in a foreign destination and you've seen, a bunch of people, typically older folks, hop off a bus with following the lead of a group leader that's got a sign and a flag. That very well could have been a smarTours trip. So in travel, and travel is an exciting category. There are many different sort of sexy and interesting travel tech businesses. smarTours and the broader tour operator industry certainly is not that. It's a sort of old-fashioned, arranging group trips and driving for healthy utilization on those buses. And despite it not being on our radar, it had a lot of really interesting characteristics that got us excited. It sits in a large, fragmented, and growing industry. The cash flow characteristics are exceptional. You collect money up front from your customers and you pay that out much, much later at or even after the time of departure. There were lots of opportunities for improvement, some of which actually proved out, some of which were just fictional for us. We also we had seen a long history of private equity firms paying pretty healthy multiples for these types of businesses. So we had a lot of conviction that if we could grow the business and professionalize it, that we would be setting ourselves up for the opportunity, at least, to exit for a pretty healthy multiple on the back end.
Mm-hmm. And give us a sense of the size of the business or any financial bullet points you could.
Sure. So the business, when we acquired it, was around $30 million of revenue, around $5 million, a little bit north of EBITDA, with a very large asterisk because it was a team of 7 people, including the seller. So pretty remarkable revenue per employee stats that rival tech companies, frankly. Pretty remarkable EBITDA per employee stats. But also, given the size of the team, that was, lean for some good reasons, but just, way too lean, unsustainably lean. The real EBITDA was certainly quite a bit lower than what was advertised on the P&L, just given how many bodies, how many heads were required to add the business, not only to grow it, but just to sustain operations. So, but
Greg, with $5 million of EBITDA, that buys a lot of people. I mean, I feel like you could come down to 4.5 million of EBITDA and hire 3 or 4 people, and you've grown your employee base by 50%. You just got so much EBITDA there.
I'm just saying, if you wanted, if you took there was the P&L EBITDA, and then there was, an intellectually honest EBITDA, and we could afford to add people, but it was inflated. That's my point.
Yeah, sure. So, but wow, if I didn't make my reaction clear, that is a really good sized business. Well, for traditional searchers, they buy bigger businesses. So as you gave us the range, 2 to 5 million of EBITDA. So this is at the top of the range that you were looking for, top of the range that a traditional searcher would look for. So that's big and good news, but also way bigger than probably most of us would expect a tour operator could ever get to. So is this kind of where did it sit in the industry? Was it a leader, or are there lots of these, or were there lots of these businesses around as you got to understand the industry?
Yeah, so it's certainly in the top decile in terms of size of tour operators, but it's by no means the largest, and not even close. So there are a few tour operators that have eclipsed $1 billion of sales, several in the hundreds of millions of sales. It's this sort of sneakily fascinating, very lucrative, very attractive category that we continue to participate in through companies that we've backed searchers to acquire, and happy to get into that later. But it's despite it being cyclical and direct to consumer, which both have challenges, it's a really fascinating category.
Yeah, and specifically tour operators.
Yeah, it's our by far our favorite sort of subcategory and often misunderstood subcategory of travel.
Absolutely. Well, so I've had, I guess you're the fourth interview with somebody who's bought a travel business. And every time we start by talking about how travel has a bad reputation, namely for the two reasons you just gave: cyclicality and consumer, and not just consumer, but high ticket consumer. Often, a lot of discretionary. Although I guess that's tied to the cyclicality. Once in a down economy, people tighten the strings, and trips is one of the first things to go. And from the four of you, three of you bought tour operators. So it does seem that if you're going to play in travel, that this is the place to play. The other was a travel agency for destination weddings, Jared Benoff. But it's interesting now, 12 years after your acquisition, you acquired in 2012, was it?
In 2013. So we launched our search in 2012, acquired a year later in 2013.
12 years later, actually an interview that will run two ahead of you. So by the time people are listening to this, it will have already run with Katherine, Butler-Dines, and Rahul Desai, her husband. They bought a tour operator, $1 million in revenue, less than $1 million in revenue. But it sounds like the category, first of all the characteristics that you said, of course, remain. The working capital is probably maybe among the most attractive things about it. There's a much more reoccurring revenue than we all think. If you can deliver a good experience there, and build something of a brand in your niche, then people will come back. You'll have a lot of repeat business.
Incredibly sticky. It has a lot of characteristics, despite being direct to consumer, has a lot of characteristics of what you would see in B2B services, frankly, from a stickiness perspective. Of course, there's no contractual recurring component or anything like that. But if you can deliver a good experience, you've got that customer for really as long as they are able to and inclined to travel.
Yeah. Yeah. So
and the cyclicality piece is obviously very important, and you've got to be very mindful of. But if you look at every cycle, you see an incredible snapback in travel coming out of that cycle. So you saw that in after 9/11, you saw that after the great financial crisis. You certainly saw that coming out of COVID, where everyone is talking about revenge travel. So there's
right.
There's a cycle, but the trend line is compelling, up and to the right. And so the implications of that are, don't overlever, don't overpay, but if you buy well, put in a sensible capital structure, you're fine.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, in Katherine and Rahul's case, so they bought this $1 million revenue tour operator, and their aim is to acquire more to bolt on, probably retaining the brand of each of these bolt-ons. And the observation that all tour operators taste like chicken. So they built some tech on the back end where the front, what faces the front, the brand is what changes. But if you can standardize and streamline the back end with tech, you can really get economies of scale by doing a strategy like this. And it just seems like it's as healthy as ever. Lest we think that technology or young people or a new generation or 10 years later that a different generation are traveling less than they were back in 2013. It doesn't seem like they are. So tour operators for the win, I guess, is my point.
There you go.
Okay, Greg. So one more call out just on the size of this business or the EBITDA of this business. So $5 million in EBITDA, a 7-person company. what was the founder story? I mean, that's quite a life this person has built for himself.
Brilliant guy. He is Israeli by birth and served in the military there, and I think just had a very keen sense of how to operate something really efficiently, not get distracted by shiny objects. Just he knew what needed to get done, cut to the chase. He had founded the business in 1996. Certainly did very well for himself just through the cash flow of generative nature of the business during his ownership period without any outside equity or debt. And then I think he got to the point, pretty classic search story, where he was ready to move on and was a bit tired, perhaps in part because he hadn't built out the team quite as much. So he had his hands in everything. A wonderful team underneath him, but he was involved in soup to nuts, absolutely everything. And I think that ran its course after a certain point, and he was ready to move on.
Well, it sounds like you guys, 30 years younger though you were, burned out even earlier than he did. We'll get there.
Oh, exactly. Touché.
So back to the accountant penciling this deal out, or what it could look like. Take us back into that, please, and start from the top.
Sure. So, a few days after the fateful event in Midtown Manhattan hosted by BDO, I met the commercial banker's friend, this accountant, his name Robert Cohen, an accountant that had a small practice in New York, New Jersey area. Had a really nice chat with him. He told me about a few of his clients, but really wanted to focus on his main client, smarTours, this tour operator that I ultimately got to know very well. He told me that that the founder and CEO of that business, smarTours, was looking to sell, and that he had been deputized to help him out a bit, not officially as an advisor or a banker or intermediary, but just help him out because it was the first time that the smarTours founder had been through any sort of sale process. And so the accountant tells me about the business. Frankly, I didn't know much about the tour operator world at all. I didn't appreciate the distinction between a tour operator and a travel agent. I like to travel, but that was about it. And then he proceeds to take out this sheet of paper and start sketching out what he thought a reasonable deal and deal structure would look like. So he lists out the EBITDA around 5 million. Says I think around a 5 times EBITDA multiple is fair. He had this notion that a sizable seller note would be in order, so he penciled out a 60% seller note, which was larger than I ever could have imagined, at a pretty favorable interest rate at 4%. And so I had to use my best poker face not to react too positively. But I was excited, a bit taken aback. I had never had that kind of exchange. It really was like somebody sketching a deal out on the back of a napkin, like you read about in books or see in movies. But it was a sheet of paper, not a napkin. But nevertheless, sort of same idea. So left that sit down with a sheet of paper with his chicken scratch, and I proceeded to just look up, what the heck does this business do? So it was a little bit backwards. Normally, a lot of searchers are coming up with a thesis and they get excited about a category and they dive in and they want to know everything about an industry, and then they start reaching out to business owners. In this case, really flipped that on its head. I had almost a deal in hand, if you will. And then I was, started Googling smarTours, tour operator. What does this business do? And so a little bit backwards, but that was the beginning of the dance.
You say it's backwards, but in fact, many, if not, I'd say the majority of searchers end up doing it that way, finding a business and then filling in their industry knowledge, as opposed to a well-constructed industry thesis. Maybe your own perch in search land is traditional search folks coming out of business school, and so maybe there's a little bit more of that thesis discipline from that cohort. But when I look across all searchers that I talk to, I think most are driven by the deal and then backfill the industry knowledge, and if they want to go after it.
That's fair. I do think you hit. Yeah, there's definitely a distinction between traditional and self-funded search, but to your point is well taken.
Yeah. So Greg, so for those in the audience who aren't grasping that that's just an incredible deal and incredible, well, it's 5x for $5 million of EBITDA is a very strong price. It's not incredible, but it's a very good price. And then on top of that, these incredible terms, 60% seller note is really remarkable. But if you would like to help us put that in context, what do you think that market terms would have been for that business?
It's interesting.
Roughly.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've thought about this for over a decade now. Because on the one hand, there's no doubt that this was an attractive sort of initial structure. And to be clear, the structure evolved a little bit. The purchase price came up just a tad, and the seller note went down from 60% to 50%. The seller felt like he had a win relative to the initial sort of anchoring from his accountant, and we were still perfectly content with the deal structure. But this question of what's market, what's fair, there's really not much of a market for a business with 7 people, one of whom has his hands in everything and is looking to retire and extricate himself from that business. So the key person risk was through the roof. And so while on paper, on that wonderful sheet of paper, it looked really attractive, it's hard to quantify what the key person risk was. So, if you go through the thought experiment of the founder and seller of smarTours hiring a banker, broker, intermediary, and running a process, it's not obvious to me that he would have ended up in a substantially different spot. Now, the 50% seller note where we ended up landing, that probably wouldn't have been in there, but there would have been considerable ongoing skin in the game for him. There had to be. The key person risk was too significant. So the deal, as I reflect on it, was, I think, much more, frankly, fair and reasonable than it sounds on the surface. When you really think about how much embedded risk there was in the business that we bought, and now that was an opportunity where part of the trade or the arbitrage was buying a business with those terms, and if we could basically mitigate or get rid of this key person risk, that was a big part of the ultimate magic of what we did.
Absolutely.
But I think it was fair. I really do.
It's such a good point when we think about kind of creating value in an acquisition. The kind of our minds all go to growth, which of course is the obvious one, but there's also just de-risking the business. So if you just de-risk a business, you create value. And then I don't think anybody would want to de-risk and then promptly sell it. But arguably you could just with no EBITDA growth, with no revenue growth, but a much more robust infrastructure. It's a much more valuable business. When you say he would have had to have some sort of skin in the game, no matter what, with whatever structure would have come up with, what just for quick education to the audience, what are the flavors of skin in the game?
Yeah, so three principally. One would be the seller note, which he had. Although a seller note of 50% of a deal for a business of this size is more or less unheard of. It's more common for considerably smaller businesses where terms are a bit all over the map. Next would be equity rollover, and the last would be an earnout. And sellers have different opinions on those three different forms of consideration. Often allergic to all three, and most allergic to the idea of an earnout. But seller notes are quite common in the search context, where sellers are looking to transition towards retirement and not stay particularly involved in the business post close.
We talk about forgivable seller notes a lot in SBA self-funded land. Is it same in traditional land for bigger deals, that there just is that is used, that
forgivable seller notes
mechanism?
Forgivable seller notes are rare. I'd say earnouts are more common, although forgivable seller notes and earnouts are sort of different sides of the same coin. They're very similar in substance, just a little bit positioned slightly differently. So no, but forgivable seller notes, you'll see them, but they're not that common.
Yeah. And just to add to that, forgivable seller notes are more about protecting downside,
correct,
whereas earnouts are more about incentivizing upside.
Correct.
There's that difference. And also, earnouts are not allowed by the SBA. So I just realized now that's why we see forgivability so much in SBA land, is because it's the only way to have either one. That's the only one you can have in an SBA deal. You told us where the terms ended, which was, you said the multiple went up a little bit, the seller note came down a little bit. Anything more to close out the transaction?
The purchase price at the end of the day was about $29 million. Half of that was in the form of the seller note, and then of the remaining 14.5, it actually ended up being 15 because you factor in fees for lawyers and accountants and so on and so forth. But of the $15 million balance, we actually raised an additional $5 million of debt. We worked with an SBIC lender that came in senior to the seller note, and then we had $10 million of equity from a mix of investors, many of whom were in the search capital, and some came in through the form of an equity gap.
Great. What's an SBIC lender?
Small business investment company. They they're able to they have favorable terms with the SBA, where they're able to get leverage from the government to juice their returns in lending to smaller businesses. It's a way that the government incentivizes lenders to go down market by sweetening the pot effectively. We worked with a firm called Tamarix. They became OFS. Those guys spun out. They now run a firm called RF Partners, and they do a lot investing in lending to the search ecosystem to this day. I think we were their first go around, but they're pretty active in 2025.
Great. And so in traditional search deals, is the debt often coming from SBICs?
It's a mix. You've got conventional lenders, just commercial banks, and SBICs. Those are the two main buckets. SBICs tend to be a little bit more flexible, creative, can go deeper into the capital structure. They're maybe more permissive of equity distributions being paid out before the loan is fully paid down. But they also tend to be more expensive. So there's a sort of a price and flexibility and sort of quantum of leverage trade-off.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're very common in independent sponsor land. Many sponsors get SBIC debt. And one of the other features of SBICs is that to the point about flexibility, many of them also take some equity or have an equity component to the capital they provide. This dynamic where in the coffee shop, he showed you his first. Of course, in any negotiation, we want the other party to go first. Um, you got that. Is there any way to engineer that?
Yeah, we encourage the engineering of that all the time with the searchers that we work with, and we've had a lot of they've had a lot of success doing that, following that advice. And really, some of it's just a matter of discipline and not being the one to lead. And some of it is just sort of how you ask the question. And often it's well, you must have thought about what your business is worth, or you got to have it. You got to have a number in mind. Everybody does. Want to make sure that I'm being, we're being respectful of your time. Let's just see if we're in the same if we think we can get to your number. So probing like that, and I'd say maybe half the time you'll extract some information, and half the time the sellers will stay tight-lipped, but it's well worth it for the 50% of the time that you get them to share something with you, even if what they share is higher than you would otherwise be prepared to offer. That's still valuable information and can save you time if they're not anchored in something realistic or favorable. But the real magic is when a seller or one of their representatives shares something with you that is even more favorable than you could have imagined, or in many cases more favorable than you would have been comfortable offering. So there's no way I would have ever put out the idea of a 50% or 60% seller note. I would have been too concerned about offending the seller, because that's, grossly off market. And so, I would have done myself a significant disservice if I had gone first.
Exactly. So, and I think that last point is the point, which is, just because the seller goes first, if you can get them to go first, doesn't mean it's going to miraculously end in a lower price for you. It's just in the chance of a chance that they have a relatively low number. In fact, one so low that you wouldn't have even offered it in mind. You want to at least give them the opportunity to put that out there.
Sure.
It's probably not going to happen. Don't get your hopes up. But if not, otherwise, like in your case, you don't want to lowball anybody. So you don't, and then you never get the opportunity for them to kind of lowball themselves. So really interesting.
Better if it's their idea. And I would say we've had several situations with searchers, businesses that we've bought with searchers, where the sellers they go first, they start low, and the value creeps up, or the structure evolves after they've anchored. Perhaps they get advice from a lawyer or a friend who's a banker or private equity guy or gal. But still, that first utterance coming from them really that anchors the conversation and goes a long way, all the way through close.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for all the transparency, Greg, and walking us through the entire structure as well. So you get into smarTours. What do you find other than a too lean staff? What else do you find?
We found that we had no idea what we were doing. We were both just finance guys. I had worked in private equity for a couple of years. Dave had worked in investment banking and then private equity, and we really didn't know how to operate a business. We really didn't know how to spend our time, what to be focused on, what was noise versus what was substance. It was a substantial learning curve. We were also, pretty young. I was, I think I just turned 26 when I jumped in. Dave was 2 years my senior, but just 28. So we were on the younger side of search. And so there was a lot of life experience that we had yet to have. There was certainly there was all the operating and the experience in the world that we didn't have. So that was a big theme, but there was also, I think, an acknowledgement of, we felt like we had time, and we also felt like we didn't have to be heroic during the operating phase. We knew that we bought the business well, despite the key person risk, especially if we could, over time, de-risk that piece, the key person risk, and professionalize the business and put in systems and, have a real team. We knew that if we could simply do that, and it's not that simple, it's hard, but if we could do that, over a number of years, we'd be in a position to have a nice outcome without, having the world's greatest, run as co-CEOs. And I also think we were very mindful and I think self-aware that neither of us were big risk takers. Despite being entrepreneurs, we certainly are on the risk-averse side of the entrepreneurial spectrum, and I think that also influenced sort of how we approach things. We were not bet the farm kind of guys, and we really never contemplated going deep into what we call the J curve of taking a big step backwards in terms of profitability to meaningfully invest in the business to then really accelerate things. We spent a lot of time thinking about cash flow generation, debt pay down, generating dividends, equity distributions to our investors. Over time, we obviously, not obviously, but over time we were able to, get our hands around the business and grow it a decent amount. But all the while, I think we knew that we were sitting on something good, and that we had a really nice opportunity at our hands just by virtue of how we had acquired the business.
Yeah. Okay. And so, just to be clear, your approach, when you say you're a little bit more risk averse, that you weren't doing a big bet the farm, big J curve play. Your point is that your attention was very much on de-risking because the business was already working. Just make it a higher quality business and a de-risked business. That was the play, as opposed to some grand growth strategy. That's what I'm hearing.
That's absolutely right. I mean, look, we were also trying to grow the business, but we weren't willing to jeopardize the, just how darn profitable the business was. We weren't willing to risk the great things that we had, because we knew that even if we didn't grow that much, we would be in a really good position. So still trying to grow the business, making bets, but were we willing to go backwards or put anything in jeopardy? Absolutely not. So it was a playing it relatively safe approach to business ownership for us.
And when you say that because the fact that you bought it well enabled this approach, what does that mean? Because you didn't have because you bought it for a lower good multiple, lower interest rate on the seller note. So basically you didn't have big debt payments. Is that what that means? Or the lower multiple also meant that to get multiple arbitrage was going to be easier because you're starting from a lower multiple. What? Yeah.
Sure. So I think we felt that, the low entry multiple, the nature of the business is heavily cash flow generative business. There's no CapEx, negative working capital, collect money up front, pay it out later. There was you couldn't construct a better cash flow profile than this business or tour operators for that matter. And so we knew that, even without significant growth, or really any growth for that matter, we would be able to massively delever over a relatively short period of time, creating equity value every year. So, we were able to pay down several $1 million of debt, approaching, around $5 million of debt each year during our ownership period.
Wow.
And that put us in a position where we if you take a $10 million equity check and you pay down $4 or $5 million of debt per year, you're generating a 40 to 50% return on equity every single year, even in a scenario where the business is flat, even in a scenario with no multiple expansion.
Yeah. Great. Wow. Yeah. More of that, please. Sounds good. Okay, Greg. Where was the business? It was
based
in
New York. New York. Couldn't get more central. It was on 42nd and 5th, right across from the New York Public Library. Didn't make a lot of sense, but it was a beautiful place to go to work. Got to have lunch every once in a while at Bryant Park, right down the street. So couldn't complain.
Oh wow, what a location! Great. Okay, so seller was doing everything, so you needed to de-risk and build out some infrastructure, some human capital infrastructure.
Sure.
We'll assume that it probably also wasn't tech or process forward, so building tech and process was going to be part of the play here.
Absolutely.
So, and how did that go?
It went well. I mean, first off, year one was all about transitioning from the seller and getting the human capital pieces in play, and learning the business. I would say that we didn't talking about not being willing to go deep into the J curve or really into the J curve at all. We didn't add to the team massively. We did it more steadily, but we with the addition of me and David and a couple other hires, we were able to significantly mitigate and the key person risk that we inherited when we bought the company. And then from a technology perspective, that was really a year two initiative where we found a real software system to transition away from a lot of paper and pen and clipboards, a touch of Excel, but it was more paper and pen than Excel, even in 2013, 2014. That was a really important step for being able to professionalize the business and then subsequently scale. Had a couple twists and turns along the way. We had to navigate the war in Ukraine, or Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We had to take a bunch of people that were scheduled, a couple hundred people that were scheduled to go on river cruises in Ukraine and try to redirect them to other parts of the world. Ebola came into the mix. That was no fun. Our largest single destination was where we sent travelers was South Africa. You might wonder what Ebola has to do with South Africa. It really didn't, because it was thousands and thousands of miles away from South Africa. But that nuance wasn't quite appreciated by the U.S. consumer or traveler. So, just
because South Africa has the word Africa in it?
Correct. No way I'm going to, getting these calls, or no way I'm going to that country. We had to, we were able to educate to some extent, but not enough. So, our largest destination took a significant hit, but we were able to navigate and still, put up a decent year nonetheless. Had that foundational year two of really putting in, a solid system that we could then use to scale.
So just going back to tour operators, are they as a category more subject to kind of black swans or random macroeconomic events? I guess it has everything to do with how diversified your destinations are, really. Key ingredient for any tour operator acquisition. If you're out there thinking about buying a tour operator yourself, you should be very mindful of the geographic or destination mix. If we were a South Africa specialist, where that was 100% of our revenue, that would have been a real problem in 2015. It was 20% of our revenue. And so it wasn't pleasant, but we were fine. It was a headache, but maybe some days it felt like a migraine, but it wasn't anything that we couldn't handle.
are they, certainly if you fast forward to what happened with COVID, that all these tour operator businesses literally went to zero top line for a period of time. But if you put that aside, it really is much more of a function of destination diversification.
But so leaving aside just the performance of the business, these crises that you then have to work around was really taxing on you guys energetically.
No question. I could. It was not just Ebola and the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the previous one, not the most recent one. Right. It was Zika. It was terrorism in Europe. Issues in Egypt. Other challenges in the Middle East. It was exhausting. It didn't have a tremendous business impact. If you look at the numbers, it did maybe stifle growth, and it was a contributing factor to stifling growth a bit in year 2, and maybe to some extent in year 3. But it absolutely took a toll, a lot to navigate as leaders of the company.
And Greg, why can't all of that be in some sense delegated away? You build out your team and they manage a portfolio, and not saying you just collect checks and don't worry about it, but it sounds like it's all on your shoulders, whereas it doesn't seem like it should necessarily be.
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe that was a leadership flaw for us, but I think when you're talking about extracting 100 mostly senior citizens from a country that is on the verge of war, or has some natural disaster or public health outbreak, I don't think that's something that you really should delegate.
Sure.
Sure. Tough decisions. Sometimes you're dealing with people's lives and livelihoods, or their health. I think there's certain topics that, whether you're running a small business, medium size, even a considerably larger business, that you've got to make the call and have your hands in, even if to your point, maybe it doesn't seem like it should be on the surface.
Yeah, well, certainly too. Some of these crises you're dealing with are extracting people who are already on the ground versus something's happened and now customers who haven't yet left need to be sent somewhere else. There's different degrees of these crises. Certainly. Yeah.
But there, even in the cases where, we had to cancel trips because of some foreign conflict, that was, I think it was stressful because it felt like it was, derailing some of the growth efforts that we had put in place. That we felt like we were doing everything right, and doing a lot of good things in our second year, and yet we were flat. In some part due to, in no small part due to Ebola. So I think it was more of there was a frustration element there too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and this touches on one of the reasons, not, one of the negatives of this category that we didn't touch on earlier, is the expectations of your customer that this is a big spend for them. This is maybe a once in a lifetime trip for them. It's like being in the wedding business. People are only going to have one wedding, hopefully. And so if you're in that business, all your customers expect perfection. So it's a command performance by you all every time.
And there's a lot that's outside of your control. I mean, it can rain on the day that you go to the Taj Mahal. It can, the incredible tour director that you hire to lead the group around Australia could have a family emergency, and you've got to backfill them with somebody who's not as experienced and, maybe 25% as charismatic as the all-star. So there's a lot that's out. It could be airline delays, which certainly a tour operator has no control over. And so you own it all as the company that cashes the check and owns the experience, and that's part of it. Now you can mitigate a lot of those issues by how you respond and providing good service in response to unanticipated events or events that are fairly clearly out of your control. But nevertheless, it's high stakes, and you get blamed unless the experience is 10 out of 10.
Yeah, and that would be drain you after a while. That pressure.
Certainly, no question.
Crises or not, Ebola or not, just the day-to-day could be draining in that way.
For sure.
We talked about the reoccurring revenue, that the quality of revenue here is higher than it might seem at first, because you if you deliver a good experience, they'll come back. What does, in general, customer acquisition look like? What did it look like?
So, the biggest source of customer acquisition was word of mouth referrals. So that's another beautiful feature of travel. If somebody goes on a trip, they have a great experience, they're going to put it up on Facebook. They're going to print photos and show them to their friends. They're going to put out a booklet and put it on their coffee table, and they have friends over. They'll brag about the time that they had in Thailand or China or Cuba or where, or what have you. And there's that natural built-in word of mouth referral engine. Now, there are some things that you can do to supercharge that, but often it's best just to let that sort of marinate and happen organically. So there's nothing that you can do to compete with just the beautiful engine of word of mouth and referrals. When we came into the business, I thought, gosh, we're gonna grow this thing like a weed through digital marketing, paid social, paid search.
Which wasn't happening at all.
It wasn't happening at all. There was not a Facebook page. The website looked like it had been created in the year the business was founded in 1996. And not refreshed. It had a very poor digital storefront, and we looked at each other, Dave and I, and we said, "This is going to be so easy." Famous last words. We did a lot to enhance the digital presence. We invested a lot of money, not bet the farm amount of money, but a lot of money nonetheless in paid search, paid social, other digital acquisition channels, and the results were pretty underwhelming.
Why do you think that is? Because this is the lever that people pull. I'm salivating listening to it.
Yeah.
And in fact, in many stories of my guests, it does work. It works just like it should. But so why didn't it in your case? Because the older demographic?
I think in part the demographic, you nailed it. But also, if you think about the nature of this purchase, it's a high ticket item, it's a extremely high trust item, so and it's a often you're selling a once in a lifetime trip, so you really have to have a lot of confidence, conviction in the company that you're going to go with, you're going to partner with on your vacation, not to mention that you're going to pay them often a year, sometimes more than a year in advance to reserve your trip. So high trust. And so you think about acquiring those customers through a Google ad. That's a bit of a tough bridge. We were also a more value-oriented provider. So we were positioned more to be a bit more accessible, kind of angling to democratize travel to these amazing destinations to some extent. And we had decent margins, but our dollar margins were gross profit margins were okay, but not great. So we didn't have a ton to work with, and it just it could only support customer acquisition costs that were so high. So there are some tour operators that are more premium in nature, have much more gross profit dollars to play around with, and I think they have a smaller addressable market too. But with good targeting, they can have success on the paid search, paid social side. But it was a really tough dynamic for us, and it makes a little bit more sense now in hindsight. But at the time, it was surprising, shocking. For really, I couldn't believe it for a couple of years.
Yeah. And then, but you did eventually land on a marketing channel that worked.
We sure did. So there were really two main levers of growth. The marketing channel that worked was not new age digital. It was going back in time and your classic direct mail. So we're about 2 years into our ownership period, frustrated by the lack of success in growing the business through this sort of digital marketing transformation that we thought we would bring to bear. And we had some conversations with an industry expert. She had recently retired. She had led marketing for a company called Colette, which is a much larger tour operator. They're one of the tour operators in the several hundred millions of sales. And she said, why aren't you guys doing direct mail? That's the silver bullet. And so, she pointed us in that direction. She got us connected to a couple experts who could, third-party consultants who could lead us down the direct mail path, and that was a big game changer. That at that juncture, it started to, instead of having these first couple of years, which were flat, where we were still growing EBITDA, by the way, flat on the top line, growing EBITDA by improving our cost of goods sold, and creating meaningful equity value by delevering, but still, stubbornly flat on the top line. Our direct mail efforts really accelerated the top line of the business. And then the other sort of key growth lever that we put in place was taking what was at acquisition 100% direct to consumer business and hiring some salespeople to build out a B2B2C sales effort. And by that, I mean selling trips through universities, religious organizations, retirement communities, local chambers of commerce, even companies that want us to take their team members, their salespeople on trips. And so we were selling the same exact products, these same tour products, just through this sort of B2B2C distribution channel, and that was quite fruitful for us too.
That worked, because that seems like one where I would say sounds good in theory, but I can't put my finger on why. But my gut would also just be like, I bet it's way easier said than done. I don't know. It's doing the B2B2C play.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think execution is everything. We hired some good people. One great salesperson, Suzanne Anderson James in particular. She was an absolute all-star. She deserves a ton of credit, but it was an easier market to penetrate and grow than on the strict B2C side. If you could build a relationship with that, somebody at a community center or church or synagogue or university and gain their trust, then they're able to leverage their audience, and they come back a few months later and said, we have 40 people signed up for your trip.
Okay, Greg. So just before we turn to your decision to exit, how long did you hold as you start contemplating exit? What year were you in, and where had you gotten top line to at that point?
So we ended up, from start to finish, we held for 4 years. At the beginning of our fourth year, so the end of third year, beginning of the fourth year, we received a couple unsolicited offers for the business. And at that point, we had even though we were just entering our fourth year of operation, because of the nature of the of how people booked far in advance, we knew that 2017 was going to be a very strong year, and we'd be just shy of 50 million of sales. So and we're able to not doubling or tripling, but not but pretty healthy growth from 30 or so when we bought the business. And we're able to we were looking at EBITDA around 7.5 million, despite having added a tremendous amount of OpEx to the business relative to when we bought it. So from 6 to 20 something employees with a lot of more software and marketing spend, and so a very different OpEx profile, and really that spoke to the de-risking away from the founder and professionalization point. But even still, despite the fact that we had grown the business really nicely in sort of the back half of that 4-year period, we still felt like we had a lot more work to do, that we could continue scaling the B2B2C business line, that we were just scratching the surface on the direct mail side. And then we received a couple unsolicited offers from, it turns out they were both independent sponsors. But they were at values that seemed really compelling to us, and were sort of surprisingly compelling to us. So we decided to first talk to our board and just get their reaction. And I remember having a conversation with a board member, investor, and mentor of mine and David's, a guy named Michael Klein, who searched way back when, before I think it was even called Search, and now has had a great career and run in private equity and runs a firm called Little John. Wonderful guy. And he explained to us that he has never experienced seller's remorse, despite having sold lots and lots of companies. He's never regretted selling. And I think we took that to heart. I think we were also quite aware that we were running an inherently cyclical business. This was 2017, beginning of 2017, when we were having these discussions with our board, and we were already 8 or 9 years after the great financial crisis. We had gotten through Zika and Ebola and the European migrant crisis, and there was no big issues with any of our destinations that were sort of derailing things, and we were on this really nice growth trajectory. Didn't want to take that for granted, and so we decided to interview a few bankers. We got three opinions, three opinions on value and sort of pitches, and we ended up going with a group called Footbridge Partners, led by John Ross. They're Charlotte and New York based, and they just ran a phenomenal process. Reached out to dozens and dozens of buyers. It was a fairly robust and broad auction, if you will, and I think they represented our interests really, really well. They knew that we were not only looking to maximize value for our investors, but also that we had a desire to ultimately transition out of the business, that we weren't necessarily looking to, work for a private equity backed business as the operators for an extended period of time. And they created a ton of interest. I think we had 78 firms sign NDAs. We had 37 indications of interest. We had 12 management meetings, which, these 12 half-day meetings were put through the ringer by private equity firms. And then we had quite a number of pretty firm LOIs, and narrowed the group down to 3, and then ultimately selected a firm called Summit Park that was the winning bidder in the process.
Greg, do you think the fact that you and Dave didn't want to continue on in the business as the leaders of the business for a time, that you were penalized for that on the price?
That wasn't, that was a concern, but I think, to Fidus's credit, and, John Ross and his team did a great job. I think they were able to, somehow address that and, and get buyers excited about the opportunity to bring in one of their own people, or somebody who had taken a business from, 50 to 200 million of revenue or 500 million of revenue. And, as much success and as many good things as David and I did, we were still, finding our way as business operators. And so I think they were able to tell that story, which I think was fair, reasonable argument to make. I think they were able to do that quite well.
Well, and the narrative would also probably have been like, these two guys, Greg and Dave, have spent the last 4 years building human capital infrastructure and building process. So they have found the business with all kinds of key man risk, and now they leave the business as a business that can take in new leadership. That was kind of what you spent the last 4 years doing.
100%. And, I think we probably could have done a better job in hindsight at, making ourselves less important. We were still at the time at the exit, as much as we had transitioned away from the key person risk that we inherited. We created some key person risk with ourselves, not nearly to the same degree. I mean, it was night and day. But yes, we did build a business that could live on healthily and profitably without us.
One point about the cyclicality, Greg, and you had said, I'm not sure you said it here, but I think in our pre-call that despite the cyclicality of travel, long-term trends in travel are great. It's a good CAGR. The travel category, when you zoom out and look at it, a decade over decade, it just continues to grow, which we all kind of understand intuitively. We're all traveling more than our parents did, who traveled more than their parents before them. So if you kind of wanted to hold for a long term, you could get comfortable with the cyclicality that way. But one thing that people need to keep in mind about cyclicality is not just that you'll be dinged on it because nobody likes it, but it also may force your hand. Once you're owner and you think about exit, it may force your hand a little bit, which is kind of what I don't want to say your hand was forced. It seems like you guys were, I think, felt good about selling, but there was, like you basically said, you felt like you were at the top of a cycle and you didn't want to push your luck. So if you find yourself in a down cycle, in a cyclical industry, in a business that you're the owner of, it may mean that you have to wait that out until an upcycle, and that's not a great thing. Just a side point.
It's not the end of the world either, because it extends your hold period, but and might not fundamentally change the return on investment that you're able to generate for your investors. It certainly might have IRR implications, but keep in mind that Dave and I were humans too. I mean, we were both at the point in 2017 where we're about to start starting families. We both had our daughter, our first of three, our daughter Sarah, in 2017. Dave had his first of two boys in 2017 as well. And so, the idea of extending potential liquidity for, if you hit a cycle in 18 or 19 and then you can't sell until 21 or 22, wouldn't have been the end of the world. But I think we were looking to de-risk and diversify ourselves, and get some liquidity sort of going into this next phase of life. Yeah, absolutely. And you knew COVID was coming, so you had to get out before 100%, COVID.
100%. If you putting all this makes a lot of sense, but let's pretend for the thought exercise here, if you had just wanted to hold on to it, you have this business now doing $7.5 million of EBITDA. As you told us, you've been paying down a lot of the debt, so you have a line of sight on $7.5 million of cash coming out of this business. if you had just wanted to hold on to that and either as a lifestyle business, actually, or to keep growing it, could you have? And I'm making a larger point about traditional search. Does this traditional search vehicle allow for that?
Yeah, it certainly allows for that. And, we would have been able to start participating in the distributions once we had, if you think through how the traditional search terms are set up, once we had paid down debt and returned all the capital to investors, we would have started to participate meaningfully in the equity distributions. And, over and above the salary and bonus structure that we had as co-CEOs of the business, it was certainly doable. It was certainly at our discretion. I think it's highly unusual because there's often a desire to sort of achieve more significant liquidity. There's also very favorable tax treatment from capital gains as opposed to equity distributions from an operating company. So there are a number of things that are at play, and as we touched on earlier, the tour operators. It's a fun business to run, but it's it can be stressful, it can be tiring, and I don't necessarily think that we wanted to be doing it, forever.
Yeah. And can you share with us what the final sale price was and what all that looked like?
Sure. So we had about $7.5 million of EBITDA when we sold. We sold it for 9 times EBITDA, which was $67.5 million. We had about $1 million of excess cash on the balance sheet, and we had delevered from $19.5 million of debt to around $4 million, and net of some transaction fees, the proceeds in aggregate to the investor group were $62.5 million. We had also
Wow.
paid some distributions along the way, just under $4 million of distributions. So, very, very happy with the outcome for everybody involved.
When you reflect back on this outcome, what's the lesson?
So I think some of the lessons are you can create a lot of value on the way in with how you buy the business, what you pay for it, how you structure it. You can play it safe and still generate an excellent return. You don't need to bet the farm to generate an outsized return in this part of the market, given where some entry multiples tend to be. You can take a relatively low risk path to an outsized return. I think there's definitely a lesson around not getting too greedy. We had what we considered to be a more than fair, in fact, really compelling offer made for the business, and rather than sitting there saying, well, we'll definitely do better than that. We'll get twice as much in a couple of years. I think we really did some soul searching around, what that outcome would mean for ourselves, for our families, for our investors. And I think with some humility, we knew that the type of accelerated growth that we were starting to experience wasn't something that we could necessarily take for granted, and that that we would be well served to go to market and hire a banker and see what we could achieve.
We've already talked about the fact that COVID then hit. But also the firm the PE firm that acquired it actually has subsequently shut it down. So you did, to the point about not taking for granted success, they weren't able to not only were they not able to make it successful, in fact, it's no longer exists, smarTours. What's the coda to the story?
Yeah, no, it's sad personally for us, but the chronology of events is the firm that bought the business, good people, good plan, got hit buy a Mack truck during COVID. Revenue went to zero, and it just was too tough, of a hole for them to climb out of, with a leveraged capital structure and revenue going to zero. It was tough, and the business was able to hang on for a number of years following, coming out of COVID after going through a Chapter 11 restructuring in 2021. The private equity firm stayed in, the lender stayed in. I think in 22 or 23, the lenders took control of the business and continued to support the company as it was trying to get its way out of COVID. And we actually had some conversations with them about potentially stepping in and buying the business back, but weren't able to come to terms. And sadly, the business shut down. And just a few months ago, actually, in earlier 2025.
Oh, wow. It's sad. Let's wrap up here, Greg. Why don't you just give us a little bit more about Footbridge and what you do today to support traditional searchers?
Yeah. So, coming out of our smarTours exit, where we had a 2-year transition period, Dave and I, we were actually pretty drawn to the idea of, fatigue aside, doing something and something similar again and buying another business. But we started, as many searchers do that have an exit, we started investing more passively behind searchers, and we just were really drawn to the idea of and this opportunity to support the next generation of ETA entrepreneurs, and we decided to repurpose Footbridge Partners. Footbridge was the name we used for our original search fund. Bring it back, and this time raise a fund to buy several businesses instead of just one. So we partner with searchers, mostly traditional, but also we work with committed capital vehicles and holdcos, and we love working with experienced operators that are looking to buy businesses or in industries that they know well. We've dabbled a little bit in self-funded, although not much. But I think really what distinguishes Footbridge is that we are, in my humble opinion, the most hands-on, roll-up-your-sleeves type investors in search, largely, if not exclusively, because we're really focused in working with a small number of searchers each year. We'll back 2 or 3, maybe 4 search teams per year instead of 20, 30, 40, 50, like some of our counterparts. And we maintain about 10, 11, 12 companies at a time. So really focused, really pride ourselves on being value added, and still not done with the travel space. We've done a number of deals, 4 deals that are either that are travel related, 2 of which are pure play tour operators, and it's been fun to get back in that industry. Maybe even more fun from a board perspective than an operating perspective, but we sourced 2 of those deals, so we've been able to, I think, bring a lot of value from the experience that we had in general, but particularly in this tour operator world.
So as I said, you're the 3rd tour operator acquirer I've talked to. You are invested in 2 others. I know of another searcher who almost bought a tour operator. So this is really a category that lends itself to search. It sounds like, that's more than at 6 or 7 people. That's more than a coincidence. That's a trend. But I think, not to beat this to death, but the characteristics are very appealing. So simple as that, I guess.
Exactly.
Great, Greg. Well, thank you for sharing the story with us. Thank you for so much transparency about the entire structure, both going in and coming out of your acquisition, and then, of course, what happened in the in-between. And, of course, congratulations on just a great search story with smarTours and what you're up to now with Footbridge Partners. We'll put a link to your LinkedIn in the show notes, and people can get in touch with that way. Greg Geronemus, thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. Really appreciate it.
Hope you enjoyed that interview. Don't forget to subscribe to the Acquiring Minds newsletter. We send an email for every episode with an introduction to the interview, a link to the video version on YouTube, and soon, key takeaways, numbers, and more essentials from the interview for those of you who don't have time to listen or watch it. Subscribe at acquiringminds.co. You'll also find all our webinars there on the website, both those we have coming up and recordings of past webinars. At this point, there are over 30 webinar recordings, a wealth of information on all the technical nitty-gritty of buying a business. acquiringminds.co.